Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. If you tuned into our video last week about cases where criminals essentially caught themselves, you might remember that at the end of the video, we told you that we actually stumbled across a ton more cases like this and asked you if you'd be interested in hearing more. The answer seemed to be a resounding yes, and though we hadn't planned on doing something similar so soon, given our recent troubles with YouTube, we decided we'd once again go for something a little bit lighter this week, if for no other reason than to keep our own spirits up. Anyway, even though a lot of these cases are going to have a similar feel, we decided to do something a little bit different than last week, and instead of focusing purely on criminals who busted themselves, today we're going to be looking at cases where criminals were served an instant dose of karma. Just before we get to today's stories, a reminder that if you find our videos interesting and informative, to like and subscribe for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. With that out of the way, here are 10 criminals who were hit with instant karma. When two English thieves pulled off a brazen daylight robbery in the spring of 2018, they likely knew to keep an eye out for the usual things that could get them caught. Witnesses, patrolling police officers, etc. One thing they didn't count on, however, was Mother Nature herself revolting against their crime, turning their windfall into more of a windfail. According to reports, the incident began at around 1 p.m. on Saturday, March 17th, 2018. When two men walked into a travel agency in the English town of Droylsden, located on the east side of Greater Manchester. Once inside, the men threatened employees, telling them to hand over whatever cash they had on them, as well as what was in the company's safe. Understandably terrified, the staff members did as they were told and handed over the money. However, in their haste, it was at this point that the criminals made a critical mistake. Rather than putting the stolen loot into a bag or some other place where it would be safe, they opted instead to simply stuff it into their pants. Then they quickly left the travel agency and began to flee. Unfortunately for the two suspects, it was a particularly windy afternoon, and as they walked down the street, it didn't take long for one of the men's stolen cash to catch the breeze. At first, it was just a couple of bills, but when the man realized what was happening and turned around, quite a bit more blew away. This continued happening while one of the hapless thieves looked on dumbfounded, and the other tried, to no avail, to chase down the flyaway cash. As you can imagine, the pair were making quite the scene in the middle of the road, and to add to the humor of the situation, most of this was caught on a nearby CCTV camera. Eventually, the criminals just gave up and fled, getting into a silver car a short distance away. While we unfortunately don't know if the two suspects were ever identified or caught, since we could not find any follow-up reports about the incident in our research, several stories we came across from the time suggested that the thieves probably lost most of the money they had stolen. Forgive us for our lame joke, but it seems their cash was gone with the wind. For this next one, we wanted to start off by saying that there's nothing remotely funny about the overwhelming majority of drunk driving cases. In most of these circumstances, it's innocent people who are hurt or killed, while the offenders oftentimes walk away from the resulting carnage unscathed. That being said, we'd be lying if we said it wasn't a tiny bit refreshing to see how karma intervened in this next case. At around 1 a.m. on Sunday, March 4th, 2018, police in Fairfax County, Virginia, attempted to pull over a man for a relatively minor equipment violation. The man, later identified as 30-year-old Isaac Bonzu, allegedly had an illegal tint on the windows of his car, and officers were expecting to simply issue him a ticket. However, things escalated considerably when instead of pulling over, Bonzu sped off, leading police on a chase. As officers would later learn, Bonzu was not only reportedly drunk behind the wheel of his car, he was actually drinking while on the road. This was also not the first time he had been caught doing so, as he had 2 previous DWIs, and a third would mean definite jail time. To top it all off, he was apparently wanted in another county for felony hit-and-run, misdemeanor hit-and-run, and driving on a revoked license. All of this is to say that at least in Bonzu's mind, there were plenty of reasons to run. Unfortunately for the 30-year-old, his alleged intoxication meant that he wasn't exactly at the peak of his mental or driving capabilities, and after about a half-mile pursuit, he drove himself into a dead end. It was at that point that he decided to bail out of his vehicle and try to escape on foot. The problem for Bonzu was that in the haste to make it out of his car, he didn't actually shift the vehicle into park, meaning that when he tried to run, he found himself in front of his car, which was still moving. It was at that point that he was hit by his own vehicle, causing him to understandably take a bit of a fall. Though the 30-year-old was not hurt, the accident gave police just enough time to catch up to him and place him under arrest. While we unfortunately weren't able to find any follow-up reports about Bonzu after his arrest, it's safe to say that he was in a pretty big heap of trouble. In addition to the numerous other charges we previously mentioned, he was slapped with at least 7 others, including felony DWI, hit and run, disregarding an officer's signal to stop, driving while revoked, driving with an open container, possession of marijuana, and of course, having an illegal window tint. In the run-up to Christmas of 2012, a Brazilian criminal was left lamenting that there was no longer any honor among thieves when he committed a robbery, only to be robbed himself immediately afterwards. According to reports, the incident began one night in December of that year, when an alleged career criminal named Mauricio Fierro pulled up to a pharmacy in the city of Sao Paulo with the intention of robbing it. Since he wanted to make sure he could get away from the scene of the crime quickly after carrying out the robbery, he left his car running and unlocked and headed into the business, where he threatened the staff and told them to put money from the store's cash register into a bag. The terrified employees did as they were told, and in no time, Mauricio had left with his stolen loot. Everything was going to plan, until the criminal walked back to the parking lot where he had left his car, only to discover that it was gone. It turned out that in the short window of time that Mauricio had been holding up the pharmacy, another opportunistic thief had come along, and finding the vehicle running and unlocked, had stolen it. We know this because the entire thing was captured on the pharmacy's exterior surveillance cameras. Dumbfounded by the irony of the situation, Mauricio proceeded to walk around the parking lot for several minutes after discovering his car was missing, appearing to sort of half continue to look for it while also expressing his frustration over what had happened. He was so caught up in all of this, in fact, that he didn't even notice when another thief snuck up behind him and grabbed his bag of stolen money, easily running off with it. Now well and truly rattled by the night's events, it was at this point that Mauricio concluded he only had one place left to turn, and decided to go to the police. When he arrived at the closest station, however, he encountered none other than the pharmacist who he had just robbed, who was making a report of their own to the authorities. Unsurprisingly, Mauricio was quickly taken into custody. The ridiculousness still wasn't quite over yet, though, as when local news channels heard about the bizarre situation, they immediately went down to the police station, where Mauricio agreed to give an interview. During the interview, he went on a rant about the insecurity of the city, and how he had barely been able to enjoy the car that had been stolen from him, which he said took a lot of work to get. However, when asked if he had bought the car, he amusingly replied that he had stolen it himself just the day before. While a lot of the criminals on today's list arguably should have seen the mistakes that led to their downfalls coming, the way this next offender was caught instead most likely left him thinking, what are the chances? It all started on November 28, 2011, when a 33-year-old man named Nathaniel Coleman walked into a store called Maryland's Boutique in Immokalee, Florida. According to what we could find in our research, the business specialized in women's clothing and accessories, though apparently also operated as a pawn shop. In any case, after arriving at the boutique on this particular day, Coleman approached the store manager, saying that he had some items to sell. In particular, he had some high-end jewelry that he thought the owner might be interested in. It turned out that interested was a bit of an understatement. In fact, the owner was fairly certain she had these exact same items at home. Deciding that the coincidence was a bit too suspicious to ignore, the store manager decided to call her husband to make sure that everything was okay at their residence. At the same time, she made sure to keep calm and collected so as not to tip Coleman off to the fact that anything might be wrong. After receiving the call, her husband contacted the police. After arriving at the business and placing Coleman under arrest, police accompanied the store owner's husband to their home. Sure enough, the back door had been broken into and the place had been ransacked. The exact pieces of jewelry that Coleman was trying to sell were also missing from the residence. The 33-year-old was charged with trafficking in stolen property, grand theft of items between $5,000 and $10,000, and defrauding a pawnbroker. Based on records we were able to find in our research, it appears that Coleman was ultimately convicted only on the trafficking in stolen property charge, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. These same records state that he is currently incarcerated on a number of drug charges, with a scheduled release date in early 2027. Back in its former nickel and gold mining days, the town of Laverton, Australia, reportedly had a reputation as one of the wildest in the western part of the country. According to reports, though, that era has long since passed, and these days, Laverton is apparently mostly visited by people on outback adventures, usually those who are passing through on their way to more well-known destinations. However, in early 2016, a group of would-be thieves briefly put the town in the spotlight once again, when they tried to steal some fuel, but instead were met with a truly disgusting surprise. According to reports, it all began one night in January of 2016, when a group of unknown suspects decided to try and steal some gasoline under the cover of darkness from a tour bus that had been left parked in town. The crime went unnoticed until the following morning, when police found a cap on the ground that seemed to belong to a vehicle's fuel tank near the bus. However, much to their amusement and likely disgust, when officers investigated the situation, they realized that none of the tour bus's gas was missing. It turned out that the thieves had opened the wrong tank, inadvertently drawing from the one that contained the vehicle's raw sewage. This is even more disgusting when you consider that most people who are looking to create an improvised siphon do so by putting one end of a tube into the tank they are pulling from and start it by sucking on the other end. As a result, let's just say that in all likelihood, one of the perpetrators was left with a bad taste in their mouth. While it's unclear if authorities were ever able to identify and catch the culprits behind the intended fuel theft, reports from the time suggest that police weren't taking the case all that seriously. One officer jokingly said of the raw sewage that he, quote, had zero interest in recovering the stolen goods, while another quipped that he hoped, quote, word of mouth would lead them to the suspects. Perhaps police simply assumed that the nasty surprise that the would-be thieves got was punishment enough for their crime. Just as a disclaimer for this next one, we know that pandemic lockdowns are a contentious topic for a lot of people, so we just want to be clear that we're not trying to comment on whether the laws were good or bad. Instead, what we're hoping that we can all agree on is that this one Canadian criminal's actions were dumb no matter what way you look at the situation. It all started on February 1st, 2021, when police in Guelph, Ontario, were called to a Tim Hortons location on Woodlawn Road near Victoria Road North. It was about 4:45 p.m., and staff at the location said that they were having trouble with a patron who had violated the province's restrictions about indoor dining and mask wearing by eating a donut indoors. The 33-year-old man was reportedly asked several times to leave, but defiantly continued to eat the donut in front of the Tim Hortons employees. When police arrived at the scene, they found the 33-year-old as described and began to arrest him under the Trespass to Property Act, as they had initially expected to do. However, Once the man was handcuffed and a search was conducted, officers soon realized that they had a bigger case on their hands. It turned out that the man was not only in possession of several stolen clothing and grocery items, he also had unopened mail that did not belong to him, as well as several identity documents and credit cards in various people's names. For his defiant donut-eating efforts, the suspect apparently earned himself an ironic dozen charges, including 5 counts of possessing identity documents, 3 counts of possessing a stolen credit card, 3 counts of possession of stolen property, as well as breach of probation. Unfortunately, sources at the time did not mention the man's name, so we couldn't look him up to see if he'd since been convicted on any of the charges. Just out of curiosity, we also would have liked to know the flavor of the donut he was eating, considering he obviously thought it was worth going to jail over. When the tables were turned on one suspect in this next story, it wasn't just karma he was hit with, but also 2 bullets from his victim's gun. At around 2 p.m. on May 14th, 2013, a man named Nia Dewan was spending a typical afternoon at the home he shared with his parents when he heard a terrifying noise. It was the sound of 3 armed men kicking down the front door of his residence on the 8200 block of Brayburn Valley Drive in southwest Houston. Though Nia struggled with the intruders, they quickly overpowered him and were able to force him upstairs and into one of the home's closets, after which they started to ransack the home. There was just one problem. The closet the attackers had just forced Nia into was where he kept his gun. After waiting a short time until he believed the coast was clear, Nia grabbed his handgun and slowly crept back downstairs, keeping an eye out for any activity. He had just made it back onto the first floor when he came face to face with one of the intruders, and the 2 of them began to exchange gunfire. The attacker missed, but Nia didn't, managing to hit the man in the shoulder and in the leg. The man's 2 accomplices quickly fled the scene. Though the wounded attacker also tried to run, he didn't make it very far, collapsing in pain out on the middle of the sidewalk. By this time, neighbors were already calling the police, who arrived shortly afterwards. The suspect who was shot was rushed to a local hospital, while Nia, who was mostly unharmed, gave statements to investigators. Unfortunately, the 2 other culprits managed to escape in a Chevy Tahoe. While it's unclear if these 2 other men were ever captured, there's a possibility that they were given up by the suspect who was caught, since we're assuming he likely didn't take too kindly to being ditched by his accomplices. Unfortunately, we weren't able to look this information up because reports at the time didn't give the suspect's name, identifying him only as a man in his 20s. Still, it's safe to say that Nia and his neighbors got the last laugh in the situation. Nia was not charged in connection with the shooting, and though residents of the neighborhood suspected they had been victimized multiple times by these same suspects before, we're guessing that they didn't bother to come back after this. Halloween of 2017 ended up being quite scary indeed for one Illinois armed robber, after he tried to hold up a hot dog stand in Chicago and ended up nearly losing his own hot dog in the process. According to reports, it all started at around 6 a.m. on October 31st of that year, when police received 2 911 calls in close succession about a shooting in the city's West Pullman neighborhood. The first call was from 2 employees at a 24-hour hot dog and sausage stand near 116th and Halstead Streets, called Maxwell Street Express, who said that they had just been the victims of a robbery. According to them, a man had come in, brandished a .38 caliber pistol, and had demanded that they hand over the business's cash, along with their own wallets and cell phones. The staff members had complied. However, the situation had turned chaotic when one of them had accidentally spilled the bucket of grease, sending money flying and the suspect running. At one point, a gunshot had gone off. As it happened, the rest of the details about that gunshot would be filled in for police during the second 911 call they received, which was from the robber himself, later identified as 19-year-old Terrion Pouncey. Though Pouncey claimed that he had been shot in an unrelated incident, It was clear from surveillance video footage, witness statements from the employees at the hot dog stand, and other evidence that he was in fact the culprit. It turned out that in Pouncey's haste to make it out of the hot dog stand, he had quickly shoved his pistol into the waistband of his pants, causing it to misfire. The resulting gunshot had hit his groin. More specifically, his hot dog. Pouncey had only managed to make it across the street before collapsing and realizing that he needed to call police. Though Pouncey was taken to the hospital immediately after he was found, given the fact that he was caught red-handed, or I guess in this case, red-panted, he was soon placed under arrest and charged in connection with the case. According to records we were able to dig up, he was subsequently convicted on an armed robbery charge and sentenced to 10 years in prison, and currently remains incarcerated at the Illinois River Correctional Facility. A man hailed by internet users as Britain's dumbest crook made headlines in January of 2020 after he managed to get himself locked in a vehicle that he had allegedly stolen. Apparently, the whole thing started sometime on the night of January 26th, when police in an inner-city area of Birmingham known as Newtown received a report about a man acting suspiciously in a vehicle. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the man as described, apparently frantic because he was locked inside the car and couldn't find a way out. Police were more than happy to oblige, and after a little back and forth managed to smash one of the vehicle's windows with a baton. However, once rescued, freedom was short-lived for the man, as officers soon discovered that the vehicle in question was stolen and had also been equipped with stolen plates. The man was arrested on the spot, and as one officer jokingly put it, quote, locked up again, only this time inside a cell. Unfortunately, few details are available about exactly how the alleged thief actually managed to get himself stuck in the car in the first place. Since most cars are able to be opened from the inside without issue, one would assume he wasn't actually trapped, and perhaps was merely unfamiliar with the car because after all, it was stolen. However, maybe he really was locked inside due to some other reason we don't know about. While we can't say for certain, one thing is for sure. The man definitely isn't one of the brightest crayons in the box. While this last story is definitely a lot more serious and far less amusing than most of the other cases we chose for this list, we decided to finish off with it both because it's arguably the best example of instant karma in a crime story we've heard of, and it's also the case that gave us the idea for today's video. In what can perhaps best be described as a case of cosmic justice, authorities in Edgefield County, South Carolina announced that a 60-year-old man had suffered a fatal heart attack recently while attempting to bury the body of a woman he had murdered. According to reports, the case began on May 7, 2022, when police were called to a residence on Tanglewood Drive in the town of Trenton, with a report of an unresponsive man lying in his yard. When officers arrived at the scene, they discovered the body of 60-year-old Joseph McKinnon. McKinnon was lying near a large hole in the garden and appeared to have collapsed while doing yard work. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Because it appeared that McKinnon had died of natural causes, authorities didn't immediately have cause to believe that there was anything more to the situation, and their priority became notifying the 60-year-old man's family. This included 65-year-old Patricia Ruth Dent, who, according to conflicting sources, was either McKinnon's wife or live-in girlfriend. However, police were unable to locate Patricia, and when they learned from her co-workers that she hadn't been reachable that day, attention turned back towards the Tanglewood Drive address. A search of the house showed signs that it had been freshly cleaned. However, traces of blood were found. Eventually, investigators made their way out to the property's garden once again, this time performing a more thorough search of the area. When they looked inside the hole near where they had discovered McKinnon, they finally found Patricia's remains. She had been wrapped in black garbage bags and partially buried at the bottom. An autopsy reportedly filled in the remaining pieces of the puzzle. While McKinnon had died of natural causes, Patricia had been strangled. Based on this information, investigators concluded that McKinnon had murdered Patricia and had tried to cover up the crime by burying her in the garden, and at some point during this time had suffered a massive heart attack. While the exact motive behind the brutal crime may never be known given the bizarre circumstances, authorities say that they are satisfied with the evidence they have uncovered. According to Edgefield County Sheriff Jody Rowland, quote, "Basically, this case is over." That brings us to the end of today's list. Okay, so believe it or not, we actually still have a ton more of these stories, at least enough to do another complete list of the hilarious criminals who busted themselves. We're probably going to do something different next week just to keep things interesting, but just like before, be sure to pop into the comments section and let us know if you'd be interested in hearing about these cases in a future video. Feel free to also include any story suggestions you might have if you know of some good cases like this. While you're there, if you find our videos interesting and informative, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you want, you can also follow us on social media to stay up to date with news about the channel. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Links can be found on the screen now, but will also be included in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.